Okay, so let's start with our first one, and it's something called the rule of thirds. And it's called a rule, but it generally is just a guideline. Of course, there's a lot of times where you can break the rule of thirds, but it's a good starting point for what composition is, and it's a guideline on how we can position our subject. And again, the subject is just whatever we're taking a picture of, whatever we're trying to highlight in this picture. So if you're taking a picture of a person, like a portrait, that would be your subject. If it's a mountain, that would be your subject. So the rule of thirds is a guideline on how we can actually position that in our frame. And it helps create balance. Right? If we go back to all of our 7 principles here, we see that balance is one of them. But lots of these principles kind of overlap with each other. So the rule of thirds can help with balance, just like leading lines can help with our focal point. Framing can help with our focal point. So there is some overlap here. Okay, so what is this guideline, this rule of thirds? It's this theory that says we can divide our photograph. So if this thick black border here is our photograph, we can divide it into thirds vertically. So we have 1/3 here, 1/3 here, and 1/3 here. And we can divide it horizontally as well. 1, 2, and 3. So what the rule of thirds says is that we should try to align any objects or subjects with these lines, right? So if we have a person, we can line them up on this line, this part of the photograph, or the other one. And if we have any horizontal objects or subjects in our image, we can try to line them up with these 2 horizontal lines. So for example, like the horizon, we would try to line them up either up on this third or on this bottom third, instead of just kind of in the middle. So this is on a horizontal photograph. This is a vertical photograph, just a different perspective on it. So let me get into some examples, because it'll be easier to actually see what I mean with actual photographs. So here's a photograph of my friend that I took before I even knew anything really about photography. I just had a camera. I didn't know anything about composition yet. But I had taken this picture and I ended up cropping it down a little bit so it conformed to the rule of thirds. So if I overlaid the rule of thirds grid on here, you can see that for the most part, this person here is lined up with the left vertical line. She's not centered in the photograph. She's off to one side, but she's not too far. She's not like lined up on the very edge of the photograph. So there is some space to her, or I guess her right, camera left, but there is even more space on camera right. Another thing about the rule of thirds is that it's not just about the lines themselves, but it's also about the intersections of those lines. If we ever have something that we really want to stand out and draw our eyes to, we want to try to line it up with those intersections. So in portrait photography, our brains tend to automatically go to the subject's eyes. So that's why in this case, I kept her eyes really close to this intersection point here. I didn't have her eyes too far up or too far down. I had her eyes right at that intersection point. So typically we want to try and line things up either with the vertical or horizontal lines themselves or at either of these 4 intersection points. So let's look at some other examples. Here's an example of where you can break the rule of thirds, where you want things symmetrical. So here's a picture of me with my bike in front of the Space Center Museum. So here I wanted it very centered. I wanted me centered with this metal crab sculpture or statue, I don't know what you would want to call that. And of course we have our Space Center building, which is very symmetrical. It's a round building. So in this case, if I put over the rule of thirds, nothing's really lining up with the intersections. Nothing vertical like my body is lined up with the vertical lines. So if you want something symmetrical, this is a good reason to break the rule of thirds. However, as soon as you go something off symmetrical, you can start to see why now I am using the rule of thirds. My body is now more in line with this vertical line. Maybe even the building itself is kind of along this third, and where the crab's claws meet, it's kind of close to this intersection. Now, this isn't a perfectly composed photograph. This is actually a self-portrait. I put up a tripod and I actually have one of the, like my remote control in one of my hands here. So it's hard to really get good composition when you are doing tripod, self-portraits with a tripod. Otherwise, if I was, for example, taking this picture of somebody else, I would definitely try to make sure that these claws were a little bit closer to that intersection. The subject's body was closer, more in line with the vertical line here, for example. And maybe even having the motorcycle along this bottom horizontal line. Okay, here's another example with my friend where we can break away from the symmetrical. When we see train track pictures, usually they're very symmetrical. Someone's right in the middle of the train track. The photographer's in the middle of the train tracks, so on and so forth. But here's an example of where I tried to change that a little bit. And since I'm not symmetrical anymore, I went more for the rule of thirds. So you can see that my friend is on 1/3 of the picture, right, lined up with this vertical line. Her face it's a little bit off from the intersection. Again, if I could go back with the knowledge I have now and take this picture again, I would have probably moved the camera even further down, like closer to the ground, so that her face would have lined up more with this intersection point. Yeah, and you can even claim that her leg is kind of aligned with this third, but again, I didn't even know. I don't think I knew about the rule of thirds yet, so this is all very accidental. This is why I like bringing in some of my old photographs, because they're good to learn from, because again, I didn't know anything at the time.